Well, good day. Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Tod Lindberg. I'm a senior fellow here. Do some work in national security policy, international affairs, American leadership. And we're having a conversation today with Peter Berkowitz, the Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department. Peter is the Tad and Diane Tobey Senior Fellow on leave from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University.
Indeed.
Peter's undergraduate years were at Swarthmore. He's got an MA in philosophy from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then a JD and PhD from Yale. So he's obviously rather overqualified for any position that he happens to find himself in. But we're glad he's able to join us today to talk about this report, The Elements of the China Challenge. This is a report by the policy planning staff in the Office of the Secretary of State. I'll just say a word or two about that office. The policy planning staff is an office within the Secretary's office. So it is tasked principally by the Secretary to undertake such research and policy planning, indeed, as he deems fit. And there's a professional staff. Peter is, of course, a political appointee and has led that office since early in 2019. Peter, let me just ask you to say a few words about the origin of this report, The Elements of the China Challenge.
Happy to do so, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss it. Immediately upon being appointed head of policy planning, I recognized what Secretary Pompeo had been making clear for some time, that his number one priority was what we've come to call the China Challenge. Secretary likes to say that his first thought upon waking in the morning, last thought upon going to sleep, before going to sleep at night, is China. China's the challenge of the age. So immediately understood that, and the Secretary made clear, that the work of the policy planning staff would revolve around the China Challenge. Some people suppose that that means the neglect of the world, but it becomes also immediately apparent, given the character of the China Challenge, that it does not entail a neglect of the world. Why? Because the China Challenge involves Chinese activity, China's inroads in every region of the world. In addition to having the Secretary's charge, understand the centrality of China to American foreign policy, I also did what I imagine many of the people who have occupied the position of Director of Policy Planning have done. I returned to what is arguably the most famous document ever produced by a State Department official, George Kennan's long telegram of February 1946. And I read it for insight, for inspiration. And on that read, summer of 2019, three aspects leapt out at me. One, Kennan, in explaining this, the emerging, we could call it, he didn't use the language Soviet challenge, but the challenge presented by the Soviet Union, emphasized that if we want to understand the Soviet challenge, we have to understand the sources of Soviet conduct. And the sources of Soviet conduct are bound up with two sets of ideas: Marxism-Leninism and 19th century Russian nationalism. So it was not only Kennan was insisting on the connection between ideas and the exercise of power, but pointing out not one but two streams of thought. Then 2 points from the conclusion of the long telegram struck me. One was Kennan's insistence that in order to prevail in the challenge of the age, to defend freedom, it would be necessary for the United States to continue to adhere to the principles that had made it strong in a great nation. Again, he doesn't quite use this language, but these are the principles of the American founding and our constitutional tradition. And finally, another point that leapt out at me was, he said, we don't understand the Soviet Union well enough. We need to train a new generation of public servants, of scholars, of policy intellectuals who who are deeply immersed in study of the Russian language, Russian culture and history in order to understand the Soviet Union. Now, I should quickly say that none of these remarks are intended to suggest that what we are struggling with right now is a repeat of the Cold War. But there is a kind of sensibility in Kennan that is very useful. He points us, it seems to me, in the right direction. So in the late fall, early winter of 2019, policy planning staff, inspired by this approach, set out to investigate what exactly is China's conduct. Are there ideas that animate China's conduct? And what kind of framework is it would be necessary to respond to the China challenge properly understood? So that's what we set out to do in the report.
And the report, which you have issued, will be available in its revised and corrected version next week, as I understand.
Yes, that's right. This is the report is now available on the Policy Plan Staff's website. We're making some corrections, and it will be small matters, but the revised and complete version will be available by Monday of next week.
Okay, well, let's get into the meat of it a little bit more.
Okay.
Let me just start by asking you to maybe telegraph some of the key. No, I wasn't in response to the length of your answer to the first question, but to telegraph just some of the key elements of the China challenge, and then we'll get into them, I think, a little bit greater depth once we put out the placemat, so to speak.
Very good. So our paper is divided into 5 parts, and I should emphasize this is a product of and by the policy, excuse me, the policy planning staff. So the first part of the paper, brief introduction, is devoted to stating clearly what the China challenge is, and then explaining why it is that we missed it for so long. What is the China challenge? We believe, and stated in a nutshell, China is a great power. Like all great powers, China seeks preeminence. But in this particular case, China doesn't merely seek preeminence within the established international order that the United States took the lead in bringing into existence after World War II, an order characterized by its freedom, its openness, and its being based on rules. China seeks to transform that order, in a way that places Beijing in a center and serves China's authoritarian interests. So that's our understanding in a nutshell of the China challenge. China has been pursuing this, we believe, for decades, but we missed it. Why did we miss it? We missed it in part out of good reasons. We sought to engage China. We had high hopes that after Deng's decision in the late 1970s to introduce capitalist elements into China's socialist economic system, that economic liberalization would bring political liberalization. That has not happened. And in fact, if you read the speeches of all 5 Chinese paramount leaders, supreme leaders since Mao, you will see that they're adamant and consistent. Opening cannot and must not mean political liberalization. They're going to stick to their authoritarian guns. And there are other factors at work as well. You're aware, you've written about the influential end of history thesis, which makes an attractive argument. And the attractive argument is that because of its both its internal coherence, because of its appeal, because of the good things that it brings about, liberal democracy will spread across the world. And it's really just a matter of time. The United States may have to nudge or persuade, but internal process will bring about a liberal and democratic world. And I suppose there's a third factor that many students of politics in the United States believe that you can understand the conduct of states perfectly well without paying attention to culture, history, traditions, even what leaders consistently and forcefully say about their interests, intentions, and goals. So all of that, I think, has led us for a long time to misunderstand the China challenge. I should immediately say that you can find any number of scholars over the last 10, 15 years who have been correcting this vision. But still, I say largely the dominant view is that we should engage China, we should bring it into the world system, that more affluence, more modernization, more economic growth will produce political liberalization. That clearly hasn't happened. So our first part deals with what the challenge is, why it's taken so long for us to grasp it. And I do believe it's fair to say, while many scholars have contributed to a better understanding of the China challenge, the real break with the conventional wisdom occurred with the Trump administration. A number of official documents that the Trump administration has published, beginning with the 2017 National Security Strategy, but also the 2018 Pentagon Defense Strategy.
Could you say a little bit about those elements of continuity? The 2017 National Security Strategy described a new era of great power competition.
It described a new era of great power competition, and it made clear that the foremost challenge is China, and that the United States had to refashion its foreign policy in light of this new challenge.
And what was going on at the Defense Department along the same lines?
Absolutely along the same lines. What it means is when you're making decisions about training, when you're making decisions about equipment, when you're making decisions about where to station troops, when you're making decisions about where to build new installations, when you're making decisions about what the Navy's going to look like, and so on, all these decisions need to be made in light of the number one challenge to freedom in our age. And so we were influenced by all of these documents, and if there is a specific achievement of this paper, it is to bring together what we already know, put it in one place, we hope in a readable fashion, and provide a kind of point of departure, we hope, for further analysis of the China challenge. So I should get back to part two of the paper, based upon the work of policy planning team, lays out China's conduct in all regions of the world. It doesn't matter. If you look at the Indo-Pacific, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at Africa, if you look at Europe, if you look at Central Asia, if you look at South America, indeed, if you look at the Northern Hemisphere, South America, North America, you see patterns of Chinese conduct. What are these patterns of conduct? Well, you see, first I should say they're patterns of conduct that are designed to achieve Chinese objectives, that is, induce a kind of dependence in states around the world. How did the Chinese proceed with this? They have perpetrated the greatest act of theft in human history, the staggering amounts of intellectual property theft, hundreds of billions of dollars a year.
Why don't you take a step back and tell us what you mean, what intellectual property theft looks like? What does that mean?
Intellectual property theft involves, often through digital means, of stealing trade secrets of high-tech companies, of the production of weapons, weapons systems, and the like. Usually, or often, it's just done through, again, high-tech means. It's one of the reasons that the Trump administration in general, the State Department under Secretary Pompeo, has focused so heavily on the threat we believe that is posed by national champion companies in China like Huawei and ZTE, who are bidding to become the 5G providers of choice. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party has adopted a doctrine of military-civil fusion. What this means is these companies and other companies are really a part of the Chinese state and Chinese military operations. And these companies if allowed to build 5G networks, will have access to the data, we believe, of the countries in whom they're creating this, both the hard infrastructure and the digital infrastructure. One way or another, enormous amounts of data will be funneled back to Beijing. This involves not only the invasion of privacy, this involves, again, loss of trade secrets, making vulnerabilities of the network accessible to the Chinese Communist Party, and so on. And more, the Bridge and Road Initiative is, we think, very dangerous. It sounds innocent enough, connect the world, but everywhere you see the Chinese engaging in these enormous infrastructure projects, bridge, roads, railroads, airports, seaports, civil nuclear energy. What you see is projects that in the short term seem desirable for countries, but in the intermediate and long term really involve ruinous financial relationships, and once again provide the Chinese great access, provide wonderful opportunities for the Chinese Communist Party to corrupt elites, political and intellectual elites in the countries. So we see great dangers there as well. 5G, I've mentioned BRI, I've mentioned intellectual property theft. There's also became very high on high priority after the global pandemic broke out. That is the commandeering of supply chains, especially supply chains related to medical equipment, medicines, and high-tech equipment. There's now a sense of urgency in creating new supply chains in which the United States, fellow liberal democracies, other friends and partners, are not reliant upon the Chinese for crucial equipment. And finally, another pattern we see throughout the world is, but especially in liberal democracies, using the freedom and openness of the liberal democratic system against liberal democracies. Confucius Institutes at American universities are an excellent example of this. The Chinese Communist Party comes in, offers wonderful terms for organizations on campus that teach the Chinese language and teach about China's genuinely extraordinary world historical culture. But under the supervision of the Chinese Communist Party, effectively deals are extracted with university campuses to toe the party's line back in Beijing. And ultimately, the Confucius Institutes work not in the spirit of a university, but in the spirit of a propaganda arm of the party back home. So these are some examples of the techniques, the programs, the initiatives the Chinese use to co-opt and exercise coercion around the world. Mm-hmm. We could add, I'm sorry going on so long, we're still only on part 2 of the paper.
Well, we have some time.
Good. So we also discuss the ways in which the Chinese are attempting to introduce distinctively Chinese standards and norms into international organizations, co-opt these organizations by rewiring them from within. And even though, and I hope I emphasized this before, I'll emphasize it again, even though the Chinese represent a very different sort of challenge from the Soviet Union. The Soviets relied primarily on their military. Nevertheless, the Chinese are developing, as they put it, a world-class military. They aim to complete this by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the creation of the People's Republic of China. But they're making extraordinary progress. They are already a formidable fighting force in and around China, and they are also a daunting force in areas of cyber, nuclear, and outer space. So when you add this all together, it seemed to us, policy planning, that China presents a credible challenger for not only for preeminence within the existing system, but as a country that seeks to transform that system in its own image. Part 3, we take up the ideas. We say there are two streams that nourish the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarianism, collectivism, and imperialism. Those are, I've already mentioned, Marxism, a certain interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, a certain interpretation of nationalism. These sets of ideas are usually taken to be contradictory. On the standard interpretation, as you know, you've written about this as well, the communist view is one of, going all the way back to Marx, ultimately a universal classless society, where nationalism is a view. Of course, we can't speak of nationalism in the abstract. We must speak of the nationalism of this people or the nationalism of that people. Nationalism is a political view that emphasizes the traditions, the cultures, the particular ways of acting, and the particular interests and sense of destiny of one people. But the Chinese Communist Party has reconciled these conflicting streams. How? By envisaging a universal order in the spirit of Marxism-Leninism, but seeing Beijing at the center and seeing that order infused with Chinese sensibility, Chinese wisdom. Xi Jinping speaks about sharing Chinese wisdom, Chinese ways with the world. And we document these two streams of thought by an examination of authoritative CCP speeches, writings, and other sorts of statements. Now, we are aware of the objections to this approach. What if this is all window dressing? What if this statement of ideas is only to rouse the public in China? What if it's only to demonize enemies? Could it really express or help us understand the interests, the goals of the Chinese Communist Party? Now, it's always possible that the language is and the ideas that are presented systematically and without let up and at great length over many, many decades. It's possible that they are mere rhetoric and nothing more. But one can't know that without actually studying the ideas. And it is a striking fact that the ideas that are articulated by the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party actually anticipate and illuminate the patterns of China's conduct. In the fourth section, we lay out China's vulnerabilities. Some of those vulnerabilities are endemic to authoritarian regimes. Some are specific to China, beginning with, authoritarian governments, of course, are have a history, a long history of being unable to maintain innovation over the long term. They have a history of being unable to maintain friendships and allies over the long term. And they have a history of spending a lot of money on internal repression. So those are general vulnerabilities of authoritarian regimes, such as China is right now. And then there's a host of vulnerabilities that are specific to China today, beginning with economic instability, demographic imbalance, degradation of the environment. As we've already talked about, the repression of minorities, so that I want to come back and say more about that. And not least these days, a greatly intensified sense around the world that China is untrustworthy because of its conduct in covering up the global pandemic that was born in Wuhan last year, maybe around this time. But now, as I'm speaking, and I'm just about wrapping up the report, I should say that I've left out an important element of China's conduct, as occurs to me as we're nearing the end and I'm speaking about the vulnerabilities. An important part of China's conduct is, of course, the way it governs itself internally. And this is in fairly strict accordance with the Marxist-Leninist playbook, right? One party, repressive rule. The party is clearly in ultimate control of society and the economy. Dissent is published and wiped out to the extent possible. Ideological conformity is ruthlessly imposed upon the people. And that ideological conformity consists largely in Marxist-Leninist dogma, beginning with the idea that the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed. The oppressors, of course, being the free world, and the oppressed being the socialist world. But the socialist world is breaking out of that with the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. And we should say that you are here the expert on these matters, but I would venture to say that China right now is the #1 violator of human rights in the world. Look at the repression by the Chinese Communist Party of more than 1 million Uyghurs in re-education, that is to say concentration camps. Look at the oppression of the Tibetans, of ethnic Mongolians, of some 70 million or so Christians in China, along with the general repression throughout China. So that takes us to a framework that we lay out in a short part 5 of the report, which we call Securing Freedom. And this part of the report is not, I repeat, not designed to set forth the State Department's foreign policy, a new American foreign policy. Much more modestly, it seeks to lay out a framework for thinking about, for refashioning a foreign policy in light of what we've learned about the China challenge, what we've consolidated over the last several years. I'll only run through it very briefly, at the risk of trying your patience, but I'll get through it briefly. In the first place, we insist that in order for the United States to prevail in what is a struggle over the shape of international order, will international order be friendly to free and sovereign nation states, or will it reflect the authoritarian proclivities of the Chinese Communist Party? That's the question. To enable the United States to lead in vindicating the free, open, rules-based international order, we must, in the first place, ensure that we preserve freedom at home. We have to preserve our constitutional traditions. We need a strong economy that nevertheless looks out for those who have suffered the most from the consequences of globalization. And we must promote a vigorous civil society where people can meet, where people can associate, where people can worship as they wish to worship or not worship as they wish to worship. And if we can preserve this kind of America, I think there's hope that we can restore something of that civic concord in the United States, which has always been crucial to meeting our challenges abroad. We need to maintain the world's strongest, most versatile, most sophisticated military. We need to be committed to the free and open established international order. We need to reassess our alliances, our system of alliances, and we need to reassess international organizations, not because there's any doubt that the United States is dependent upon alliances or dependent upon international organizations, but we want to make sure that the alliance system is serving the interests of freedom, and the same for international organizations. And we may need to make revisions, but any revisions we make have to be in light of the right principles, our commitments to freedom, to individual freedom at home, and the constitutional system that makes it possible, and the free, open, rules-based international order. education is a very important part of the framework for making policy. The American people need to be educated about the China challenge. I think one of Secretary Pompeo's most important achievements has been educating the United States about the centrality of the China challenge. And one of his great diplomatic achievements has been traveling the world, speaking to allies, friends, and partners in every region of the world about the urgency, the scope of the China challenge. In addition, as in the 1950s, we need to stand up a new generation of public servants and policy intellectuals this time who are serious students of Chinese language, Chinese culture, Chinese history. And I mean real masters of the language, men and women who will be capable of reading documents in Chinese and conducting affairs of state even in Chinese. And not only in Chinese, because part of the China challenge means having better understanding of other challengers, including Russia, but it also means understanding our friends and partners better. We should have more people in public service who are fluent in Arabic, fluent in Hindi, fluent in Persian, and fluent in the language of both rivals, friends, and partners. We need an educational system at home that both presents a well-rounded account of American principles and constitutional traditions, and we need an educational policy that supercharges the American economy by supporting the study of STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, math, so that we can continue to lead the world in science, in innovation, in entrepreneurship. And finally, we need to look for every opportunity to affirm our principles abroad and affirm them proudly. Beginning with, yes, speeches which explain America to ourselves and to the world, and using all the tools in the diplomatic toolbox, meeting with dissidents, providing support, investing in infrastructure, investing in educational programs, sanctions where necessary, and where all else fails and our freedom and our interests are threatened, you see a military force as well, so that we have everything available, all our resources available, with the ultimate aim in mind, which is securing freedom at home, and integral to securing freedom at home is securing the free, open, and rules-based international order.
I'm reminded of the last line of Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth, which is, "We will now please to begin." All right, so a lot of people say Xi Jinping is different.
Yes.
He is more ruthless. He is more of a consolidator. He is more determined to cling to power. He's a different kind of figure from Deng Xiaoping, who brought open markets to China. Your analysis says something different. Could you spend a little more time on that?
Yes. So we spend less time on how Xi may differ personally and in his personal rule. What we do emphasize, though, two things: the continuity in thought combined with the profound differences in circumstance. Deng, yes, was outwardly much more conciliatory. But remember, Deng was not presiding over a powerhouse. He was not presiding over a great power. He was presiding over an enormous country with an extraordinary history. But China, as the Chinese Communist Party has been clear, lagged in modernization. Deng's decisions allowed for China to modernize. It's a mistake to speak of China today. It would be a mistake to speak of the China that Xi inherited as a rising power. That China was a risen power. Deng, more conciliatory, also was famous for the phrase, hide your capabilities, bide your time, or for short, hide and bide. And that is a perfectly sensible argument. If you have grand ambitions, but you're weak and lagging, talk softly, But 4 decades have passed since then. She inherited a great power, an economy that was growing at double digits, a military that had already been very significantly built up, and already a globe-spanning power. So the point that I would emphasize is that she is in a much better position to speak aggressively. But the more aggressive speeches of Xi are not inconsistent with the writings of the Chinese Communist Party of the 1970s, or the 1980s, or the 1990s, or the 2000s. Those writings anticipated a great power China, and anticipated a world with Beijing at the center. Xi is in a much better position than any of his predecessors to act on that vision.
If the Director of Policy Planning in the Politburo in 1979 or thereabouts researched a paper and published it called The Elements of the American Challenge, what would it have said?
What year are we talking now?
Well, I said 79, so yeah. But
well, in general, it's a wonderful question because we know what they would have said. They would have said, in a way, they've been writing this consistently. They've said, and consistent with standard Marxism, Leninism doctrine. The United States is a great, in fact, the gravest threat to all we stand for. Because, again, consistent with, for example, the Communist Manifesto, the world is divided now, increasingly divided into 2 camps. The United States speaks of freedom. It speaks of opportunity with capitalism. But actually, the United States is the #1 exploiter. Whereas we are the true liberators, the United States speaks of political emancipation, which gives individuals freedom, but that's freedom to take advantage of others. Whether we speak of the true human emancipation, which will allow us and the world ultimately to live in peace and harmony and goodwill. So this is a vision that we have been hearing since the middle of the 19th century, first from Marx, then from the Marxist-Leninists in the Soviet Union. We hear it from the Marxist-Leninists in the Chinese Communist Party. The America challenge, the challenge of liberal democracy, hasn't fundamentally changed. And I will give the Chinese Communist Party credit one respect, and for that matter, the Marxist-Leninists of the Soviet Union, Marx himself. They did understand there is a fundamental difference between what they want and what the United States stands for, in my judgment, properly stands for. Now, they profoundly misunderstand our understanding of freedom. But I think at this point, the historical record is really fairly clear. I take that back. The historical record is crystal clear about the consequences for individuals and human dignity of adopting the Marxist-Leninist, the Chinese communist approach. It means repression, it means the destruction of human dignity, it means the violent attempt to impose one way of thinking on everybody at home and bring nations of the world under the subjugation of the central power, Beijing, here.
And when our policy planning director of the Politburo describes the world in those terms, he is really describing the systemic characteristics of an authoritarian communist world versus the free world, improperly so called in the view of our policy planning director in Beijing. But he doesn't say so much about China and Chinese nationalism, which you said is also an important thread in our effort to understand this. Nor has he said anything about anything particularly cultural or social characteristics of the United States. Do we need to add an element as well?
Well, sure. If his paper mirrored ours, he would talk about. He might speak about American nationalism, but he would certainly speak about Chinese nationalism, and we know that because because Chinese Communist Party writings about China have never ceased to talk about the importance of rejuvenating the Chinese nation from its century of humiliation beginning in 1839 and the Opium Wars in which the British came and the British inflicted heavy blows on the Chinese. So rejuvenating the Chinese nation has always been a central plank of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, if we jump from 1979 to today, that nationalism is even more prominent with Xi's language of, I quote now, the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. And Xi is at pains, and quite convincingly in my eyes, in saying this is not a departure from the doctrines of the Chinese Communist Party. This is an expression of those, of the doctrines to which we've always adhered. No backtracking from our commitments to Marxism, Leninism, socialism, communism, which are all slightly different. All that is in the service of revivifying the Chinese nation and enabling it to exercise the role in world affairs which is rightly its, that is, as the central power.
Mm. And you talked a little bit about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. What's the proper word for that? What's going on there? Is it genocide?
You know, I'm sitting next to one of the nation's leading experts on that matter, and I can remember having put this question to you over the summer. Let's put it this way, and actually in this case I will throw the question back to you. It certainly is a terrible, heinous crime against the Uyghur people. The purpose of their imprisonment in these concentration camps, re-education camps, is to purge them of their ethnic and religious sensibility. It's to convert them into good Chinese. The cruel and heinous conduct includes sterilization, forced abortions, and other tactics that are aimed to either transform them into good Chinese citizens and or simply dehumanize them. It sounds to me like a crime against humanity.
Well, it sounds to me like you've met the elements of the crime of genocide, and I can certainly understand why it might not be the role of the policy planning director at the State Department first to make that observation. But yes, you have met the elements of that crime in your description of the situation.
I defer to the experts on that matter, and once again restrict myself to identifying elements.
Okay. I want to broaden the conversation a little bit. I mean, obviously we could spend, and probably will, many hours talking at greater length about China. But I wanted to ask you a few questions about how you think the Trump legacy will be viewed, and what do you consider to be the signal achievements of the State Department, of the Trump administration?
Yes, I think, and you will immediately see why, that it would be better for me to speak about how the Trump legacy should be viewed and to speak how it would be viewed. Although two different questions, and both could occupy a great deal of time. So I will speak to your first question very briefly. Already, Trump legacy is understood in terms of a profoundly misguided and deeply harmful unilateralism and isolationism, characterizing administration, and a rejection of multilateralism. So this, I think, represents a profound distortion. And the distortion is based on a misunderstanding of multilateralism, or maybe I should put it better, on what I regard as an eccentric understanding of multilateralism. I find that many people in the United States, and not only in the United States, mean when they say multilateralism, they mean United Nations supremacy. That means submission to whatever is decided, whatever the majority in the General Assembly believes. Call me a literalist, if you will, but when I hear the word multilateralism, I think of a many-sided foreign policy, or working with a variety of other countries. As soon as one sees multilateralism in that way, one should be able to see more clearly that the Trump administration and the State Department under Secretary Pompeo has been vigorously multilateralist, not exclusively, but vigorously multilateralist, not least in its China policy. So, what should be seen at the center of that policy? Well, first, where we began. I believe the Trump administration and Secretary Pompeo, I think, played a vital role in this matter, reoriented American foreign policy around the China challenge. He has embraced dissidents. He has called attention to the outrageous abuses of human rights in China. We have prosecuted, the United States has prosecuted espionage and the stealing of trade secrets by China. We have taken tough stances in the South China Sea, in Taiwan Straits, in international waters. And by the way, very importantly, we have revivified America's friends and partners in the region. I believe it's fair to say that bilateral relations between the United States and India today are as strong as they've ever been. Moreover, I believe the Quad framework, the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, is as strong as it's ever been, with all four partners committed to promoting commerce and defending a free and open Indo-Pacific. That's very much part of Trump administration legacy and the legacy of the State Department under Mike Pompeo. The Middle East, President Trump, and then with Secretary Pompeo in position, took the United States out of the JCPOA, imposed tough sanctions on Iran, a maximum pressure campaign, and this had two purposes. One, I think we've succeeded, greatly reduce Iran's capacity to sow terror, destruction, and death throughout the Middle East by depriving it of capital. Been less successful with the second aim, which is bringing Iran back to the negotiating table. But we've been extraordinarily successful, that is the Trump administration, been extraordinarily successful in working with our friends and partners in the Middle East. No president before Donald Trump was ever able to secure more than one peace agreement, or broker one peace agreement between Israel and an Arab country. Donald Trump has now formalized two peace agreement, normalization of relations with Bahrain and normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates. This is extraordinary, and we really should pause for a moment to understand how extraordinary it is. The conventional wisdom ever since Oslo, but certainly for the last 20 years, has been there can be no peace agreement, no new peace agreement since Jordan in the mid-1990s between Israel and Arab state that doesn't go through a comprehensive settlement with the Palestinians. It turns out that conventional wisdom was false. All the experts were wrong on this. It turns out that that normalization can be achieved with American friends and partners. And from my point of view, by the way, this provides wonderful the normalization with UAE, Bahrain, Sudan has said that it's going to join, establish normal relations with Israel, join the Abraham Accords, maybe other countries are to follow. These agreements represent extraordinary opportunities, and not just little heartwarming matters like this. You can see now on YouTube a video of an Israeli tourist in the United Arab Emirates walking through a extraordinary supermarket. I think it's actually Whole Foods. I could be wrong about that. He's got his video taking shots of displays of fruits and vegetables which have signs on them. Made in Israel and an Israeli flag. And in the background you can see men and women in traditional Arab garb, desert garb, and also men and women in up-to-date modern clothing. This is inspiring to see the warmth, the welcome of Israel. But what I want to emphasize is I believe that this normalization of relations actually provides opportunities not only for the Israelis, not only for the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Sudanese, not only for the United States, because we have an interest when our friends or partners are walking together, but all peoples, and I believe, including the Palestinians, can share in the new relations that have opened up, the new partners that have opened up in the Middle East. In Europe, Secretary Pompeo has worked assiduously to discuss the China challenge with our partners there. We've launched a U.S.-European conversation about China. Thanks to the efforts of the Trump administration, the NATO countries have already given, since 2017, $130 billion more than they had intended to, and promises of up to, I think, $400 billion additional dollars in 2024. This is very important to the administration's view of sharing responsibilities with our friends and allies. In this case, sharing responsibilities for the defense of Europe. Trump administration has also imposed, I think, more than 360 separate sanctions on the Russians for their efforts to undermine, for their violations of the norms and standards of the international order. One sees initiatives in Africa as well, South America. Wherever one looks, one can find the United States working with partners to produce a more secure, a more free, and more open international order.
Okay, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I'd say the other biggest project that your office undertook under your leadership was probably the Commission on Unalienable Rights. And this was, you were charged by Secretary Pompeo with exploring the American tradition in order to illuminate the human rights agenda of the present day. And I thought I would give you a chance to say a word or two about that before we have to come to a conclusion.
Well, I'm grateful that you did. Thank you very much. And I'll say in advance that I think that undertaking is closely connected in Secretary Pompeo's mind, and rightly so, with his understanding of the China challenge. So as you know, in the summer of 2019, Secretary Pompeo created this commission. It's an independent commission. It was chaired by Marianne Glendon. As head of policy planning, I served as the executive secretary. And the commission was given a mandate. The mandate was, as you said, reground America's undoubted commitment to human rights and foreign affairs and our founding principles and constitutional traditions, but also in the obligations that we took on in 1948 in leading the efforts to secure approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN General Assembly. Now you might ask, well, why is that necessary? And because the Secretary saw that that more than 70-year-old human rights project has become a subject of controversy, real controversy about the nature and scope of human rights, concerns about the politicization of organizations that, including international organizations, as well as NGOs that deal with human rights, and the concern that 70 years after the launch of the modern human rights project, fully half the world continues to live under authoritarian governments. So this was out of genuine concern to preserve human rights as an element of American foreign policy. Secretary Pompeo asked for this clarification. Marianne Glendon, the chair, gathered together a remarkable group of men and women of diverse backgrounds, diverse areas of expertise, including the Constitution, international human rights law, international law, the humanities, philosophy, religion, a variety of backgrounds to produce this, the report. And the report, I should emphasize, does not attempt to set forth a new human rights policy for the United States. The State Department has a bureau, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. It's their job to craft and implement human rights policy, although these days, as you know, as an expert on these matters, all parts of the State Department and many other departments deal with the question of human rights. Our job was to help clarify the issues, throw into sharper relief what the key questions are, gain clarity where things had become muddy and obscure. So we explained the American political tradition that despite its many and undoubted defects, is still, we believe, a shining example, nations of the world, of what it means to create a government that is rooted in the belief that every human being, just by virtue of that person's humanity, is entitled to fundamental rights, and that it's the principal job of government to protect these rights. And in the American context, the excuse me, principal vehicle for protecting those rights is a constitution of limited powers. And a big part of the report is devoted to explaining the struggle in the United States to live up to that tradition, to live up to that soaring promise, beginning with the evil of slavery, and we move through the struggle of women to secure the right to vote, the civil rights struggle, and so on up to the present moment. We emphasize this point that all these struggles and every criticism of the United States, I shouldn't say that, but most of the criticism of the United States, effectively, whether it knows it or not, is actually drawing upon our founding principles, which only reinforces in our mind, members of the Commission, the importance of those founding principles. We also we offer a close reading of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really an important foundation of the post-World War II human rights project. We show that it is it deserves to be a foundational document, and a careful reading helps guide us in dealing with a variety of the variety of controversies that have arisen today about the implementation of human rights. And in the concluding part of our report, we deal with new human rights challenges. Prominent among them are the Chinese Communist Party, because of its size, its ruthlessness, its repudiation of the norms of freedom and individual dignity, and in the field of technology and the new threats wielded by the Chinese Communist Party of artificial intelligence. And we close with some final observations. And the 12th observation, I believe it's the 12th and final observation, brings us back to the elements of the China Challenge. We speak about we write about the seedbeds of human rights. It's good to understand the doctrine of human rights. It's good to understand the history of human rights. But what is important in the United States, to cultivate each generation anew, members of which understand where our rights come from, understand the political structures that secure those rights, and understand the responsibilities that come with a nation devoted to securing rights. So the defense of human rights in our age, as in all ages, for that defense, so too for prevailing in the China Challenge, it's vitally important that we we remain true to our founding principles, the best in our traditions, and the only way to do that is through an educational system that is not only devoted to teaching those principles, but itself is rooted in the principles of freedom.
Well, we made it all the way around from China to the rest of the world and back again. There's a convention, I suppose, in Washington, discussions such as this for public audiences, for the two interlocutors or more on the panel to pretend as if they are all old friends and you know, that kind of fake bonhomie. In our case, we've done something a little bit the opposite since Peter has been a close friend of mine for going on 20 years now, and so we have pretended to be slightly more distanced from one another than is the norm. But in any case, Peter Berkowitz is Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. And it's been a great pleasure to have you here at Hudson Institute for this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Todd. I look forward to carrying forward the conversation over a glass or two of whiskey.
All right.